presentation will be the 1972 flood. He will be assisted by his grandson, Dave Decosmo. No news is good news.
That's true. Well, good evening, everybody. I mean, it seems that every time we're dealing with some kind of water-based disaster, I'm here, Titanic, and now Agnes. And Anthony is going to help me. I've got a couple of photos I want to make sure you see. I guess I can get away with saying that you were about to be, if you excuse the expression, flooded with pictures and video of the Agnes flood, because there's all sorts of efforts that have been going on for about the past month and a half, as far as I'm concerned, but probably further back than that, to put together some very special presentations. There will be a documentary presented at the Kirby Center in Wilkes-Barre on the 23rd, the actual 50th anniversary. That's sold out already. But on the 29th, they're going to repeat that at both an afternoon and an evening showing. On the evening of the 23rd, WVIA will be doing a documentary. I've been working very closely with the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They're going to be doing a documentary online. And next week, I will be speaking on a Zoom call to emergency management directors across the country, talking about my experience with Agnes, what I learned and consequently what we learned, and then looking into how some of that may be applied to any future disasters that may come along. When we talk about Agnes, you've got to kind of remember one thing that people tend to forget. In April and May of 1972, northeastern Pennsylvania had a tremendous amount of rain. And that's important because the ground was already saturated with water when Agnes formed as a tropical storm. So very frankly, even if Agnes had come through just as a very bad weather storm, there would have been low-lying area flooding. That was unavailable. The problem was, of course, that with regard to Agnes, it wasn't merely a heavy rainstorm. It was a deluge that came down several days in advance of the 23rd. It hit our area, went out towards sea, and doubled back into New York, dumping additional rain on northeastern Pennsylvania and on New York. Now, as you obviously know, we're sort of downhill from New York. So all the rain that falls there winds up coming down here. In 1972, I was the news director of WILK Radio in Wilkes-Barre. And on the 22nd of June, it became obvious that we could have a very serious problem because of the saturated ground and because of the heavy rain we then expected. Civil defense was the precursor of the Emergency Management Agency. So civil defense was the agency to take the lead in dealing with a possible flood. Civil defense had a river watcher, a man whose job was, among other things, to take readings of the depth of the water in the Susquehanna and to watch the depth of the water elsewhere. His name was Nick Suchek. General Frank Townend was the volunteer director of civil defense. And in an emergency situation, he is called in to direct all of civil defense activities. So while Nick Suchek kept pace with what was happening with the river, General Townend made preliminary reservations to get the National Guard ready, to call them in if need be, and get whatever could be set up in advance ready to go. Well, obviously in a situation like that, these emergency workers are very, very busy. Now I'm a newsman. I've got to get the information. I've got to get it to you. But it occurred to me that WILK was the emergency station. We were the station if there were some sort of emergency, we were to broadcast information. Well, we had a two-way radio at the Luzerne County Courthouse. And I talked with my boss and I said, wouldn't it be better, rather than calling them on the phone and interrupting them, Why don't I go there, be with them, and call back information to you on that two-way radio? My boss, Roy Morgan, who was the chief executive officer of WILK, okayed that plan. And that seemed pretty simplistic to me, nuts and bolts. The reporter goes where the news is and calls the news back. Where my plan fell short was the fact that civil defense had just about everything they needed, with one exception. The man who had volunteered to be their public information officer didn't show up. So the link between civil defense and at least one very public outlet didn't exist. And I was literally drafted as civil defense public information officer. Now, to make things exactly right, I called my boss and said, this is what they want me to do. In essence, it means giving information not only to you, my employer, but to everybody else. He was very civic-minded, and he said, David, go and do it. Do your part. So I stepped into the role and was aided by a suggestion by a man who helped get me into broadcasting. His name was Ron Giulianardo. He used the name Ron J, and he worked at WAZL in Hazleton, where I started out as an errand boy in 1959. And Ron called me and said, David, if your station will give us permission, we will, at a certain point of the hour, pick up your signal and rebroadcast it on our station. In essence, competitors working together. I said, Ron, we would be very pleased if you do that, and you've given me an idea. And I contacted a total of 11 other radio stations who all agreed that at 15 minutes past the hour, just past where we are now, for 5 minutes we would do a broadcast. We would be a network. We would be a flood network. We would give information to everyone who was listening. And if you regularly listen to WSCR in Scranton, you would get that information. I'm not sure if WCDL in Carbondale was with us or not. I don't remember. They may have been. Point was that your local station had access to that information. Now, why was that important? A couple different reasons. Civil defense was very concerned about the rumor mill. We had an example. Someone well-meaning called one of the radio stations and said the river is coming over the levee at such and such a place. Well, what was happening was there's a lot of wind along with the waves, and waves were splashing over at that spot. The levee was solid, but it would appear to the untrained observer that the water may be breaking through. Well, that station broadcast a report that the levee had been breached. So imagine if that was your station and you lived in that area, and you think, my word, they're telling us it's coming over, let's get out of here, let's run for our lives. Well, there was an emergency that was building, but it wasn't at that stage. So fake news originated there in a sense. And again, well-meaning, someone saw something, reported it in the station, passed it along, but it was inaccurate information. So civil defense felt it was important, at least at one time during an hour, where everybody got the right information. And if we had a report like that, and we could report the actual situation, we would make sure that that 5-minute broadcast included the accurate information. So my credit has to go to my colleague at WAZL in Hazleton for putting that network together. It was, as one book that was written about Agnes said, radio was the hero of the hour in terms of getting that information out. Technically speaking, we did broadcast information that normally the FCC would not allow you to broadcast. Personal messages are generally prohibited on radio and television. But if we knew that Joe Smith was at location A and Joe Smith's wife was at location B across the river, and they were worried about each other, we could broadcast and say, Joe Smith is at such and such a place. He wants his wife to know he is safe. And that would get that information out. So we could be very specific in some cases and calm a lot of the nerves. There was one working telephone in Luzerne County. And obviously you couldn't call anywhere else in Luzerne County. Now, here's where a little hitch in the problem came in. Civil defense could deal with Mother Nature, but it wasn't really designed for that. Civil defense stemmed from World War II. When you look back at times in England when you had people out there, air raid wardens, that were, when the siren sounded, told people you must get to the shelter now. Civil defense evolved from that. Well, in 1972, the Germans posed no threat, but some folks in what was the Soviet Union did. We were at the height of the Cold War. Significance? Civil defense had to be prepared to be ready to broadcast in case of a nuclear attack. They had to be somewhere safe. Well, their safe spot was in the sub-basement of the Luzerne County Courthouse. Most people know the Luzerne County Courthouse is a big basement. Most people do not know it has a basement below that basement. And that's where civil defense was located. That's where my two-way radio was located. And so the initial reports were going out from there. And then at a certain point, the drain in my little office became a fountain. And I didn't think it was right for water to be coming into the room through a drain. So I told General Townsend, who came over and looked, and said, we're going to have to leave the Luzerne County Courthouse. We're going to have to get out of here. The late Ethel Price was one of our commissioners at that time. She said, David, help me move some of these boxes upstairs. Some records there, old paper records. There were a lot of them. We couldn't move all, but we moved some, this woman commissioner, myself. And she's telling me as we're walking up the steps, David, some of those records were signed by Benjamin Franklin, because he was the state treasurer of Pennsylvania at one time and had to sign some of these documents. So we saved some records that had historical significance to them. We moved upstairs at first, and Nick Zuchak kept watching the river, and General Townsend and Nick said, on that day, on the 22nd, we have a chance to beat the river, but we need 10,000 volunteers to man sandbags to do it. So our network got on the air, and we called out a request for 10,000 people. Anthony, would you take this to these lovely ladies here and have them pass it around? Start over there, and after they've seen it, you can take it to the gentleman in the back.
Thank you.
The top photo that you see there is a shot of some of those volunteers that turned out for us, thousands of them, mainly college students for the most part, but not necessarily. There were older people as well. And of course, this is just one little section of the levee. This is just down from the Luzerne County Courthouse. And it was amazing. One of my news colleagues who has since passed away, Tony Massari, was also a professor at, I forget what school, I think it might have been King's, yes, King's. And he wrote a book after the flood, and he suggested we should have evacuated on that day, on the Saturday, on the 22nd. And to do that, we would have had to evacuate at night. Now you're suddenly telling people they have to get out of their homes at night. Very bad time to go. You know, you're in a panic situation to start with. Don't know exactly where you're going. And we didn't, number one, we didn't feel that was safe. Number two, if we'd done that, we wouldn't have got the volunteers to man those sandbags. As I say, the first upper photo was them manning those sandbags. The second one was when the siren went off. Let me explain what happened. As they were making their efforts, early in the morning of the 23rd, to sandbag the levee system. Nick Suchak got a river reading from Towanda, Pennsylvania. Now, the river is very, very regular in terms of increases in height, point A versus point B. When Nick saw the river reading at Towanda around 10 o'clock on the 23rd, he came in and told General Townend, sandbagging is not going to do it. We cannot get it up high enough. So General Townend told me we're going to have to sound the sirens. Now they had already evacuated a couple areas, a couple of low-lying areas like up in Plains Township, along the river, and down in Plymouth. That was done the day before because they were pretty much in imminent danger. He told me we're going to sound the sirens. I went outside. Actually, I'd been outside a couple times before the decision was made. And on one of the times that I went out, Anthony, what you see in this photo is aftermath. You take it to the ladies. This is what was the North Street Bridge, or the Pierce Street Bridge, right next to the county courthouse, linking Kingston and Wilkes-Barre. If you lived in Kingston, you called it the Pierce Street Bridge. If you lived in Wilkes-Barre, you called it the North Street Bridge. The replacement bridge is now the Veterans Memorial Bridge. So we can agree on a name. I stepped outside to do one of my reports prior to the evacuation, and I saw that bridge go. I saw it crumble apart. And the strange thing was you couldn't really hear it. The water was so loud, you could see it going over the bridge, but then all of a sudden you heard a little bit of crumbling in with the water, and there goes the center section of the bridge. So, I mean, that's one of the sights I will never forget, seeing that go. Now the decision is made, we're going to have to get out. And ABC Radio had called me to do a report. And as dramatic luck would have it, I was outside doing a report with ABC Radio telling them the sirens were about to sound, and whoom, as though I had cued them, the sirens sound. And as I've said so many times, if you count my Facebook daily blog, I have now been in the media 63 years. And I am most remembered for these words: get out now. You still have time, but you must get out. The river is going to come over the levee system. And the evacuation started. Now our network was able to tell people about various shelters that were set up. A lot of people went to relatives, of course. But within a short time, it was obvious it was going. We had to move the command center because the courthouse was still in more jeopardy. We didn't know how high it was going to get in there. We moved it blocks and blocks away, but uphill to the Wilkes-Barre School District Administration Building. Now at this point, I didn't have my two-way radio. Plus, the lead station, WILK, had its transmitters in a low section of Hanover Township, so it was doomed. It was going to go off the air. One of the stations that existed at that time was WYZZ. It was an FM station, and the owners there agreed to be the main lead station. The others could pick up their frequency. Now, communications between Civil Defense and WYZZ. You've probably all seen the old Army movies where they pick up the phone and they wind it, and on the other end you hear it, and somebody, that was our communications. A wire run through blocks and blocks and blocks of Wilkes-Barre City from the school district building to the studios of WYZZ. We only missed, I think we were on the air for probably a week, maybe 2 weeks. We missed one report. 2 kids found the wire and decided to play jump rope and broke the wire. It was the only one of the reports that we missed on that flood emergency network. And of course, as things went on, it got worse and worse. Now you had the water coming actually over. People were now finally out anyway. Now it hit. Now it hit. The devastation is unbelievable. It was, in 1972, the greatest natural disaster to hit the United States. We've had worse since, but at that time it was the worst. Those are the words of a fellow named Richard Nixon, who saw the devastation, actually came in. Anthony, if you pass these around, the single one is a home on Plymouth Avenue in Wilkes-Barre. The other one is all Riverside Drive. Riverside Drive is, if you've ever been through Wilkes-Barre, it's right next to Wilkes College, Wilkes University. And
Oh my God.
it was, when it came over there, those homes were pounded. I had a friend named Fred Nye who worked at the time for the Sunday Independent newspaper. His home was not knocked over like you see some of these. His home was gone. There was a foundation left where his home had stood. It was that terrible. And
What was that, honey?
The broken piece on that one is right there.
Oh.
Anthony's giving some information on the specifics of these pictures, which of course show tremendous devastation. All these pictures are from one of two books that were published on the flood. One was called The Wrath of Agnes, and I'm not sure about the other one, but there are actually a lot of books around. But these two were done right after the flood, and I kind of count on them because their pictures were very, very fresh and new at the time. Of course, there were all kinds of disasters. Now, if you've seen or if you watch any of these upcoming broadcasts, one of the things you're going to see is aerial views of Wyoming Valley flooded. And in an area called Northampton Street, you're going to see a lot of smoke coming up because we had a fire that broke out at some major complex in the downtown area.
That one broke.
They were the lucky people.
Oh,
Why were they lucky in the midst of this flood? They have a fire. You know, they had fire
Maybe they
insurance.
took insurance because of the fire.
They had insurance for fire, but nobody had flood insurance because it didn't really exist at that time. It was available, but who got it unless you were in an area that already had been plummeted a number of times by fire. So that was a strange thing. Along that same line, my late brother Jim had just purchased a home on Franklin Street in Wilkes-Barre. His furniture had been due to come in on the 23rd, but had not been delivered. His piano, a grand style piano, or baby grand style piano, had been delivered. For some reason, I still don't know why, our minister's guitar was at his home and it was on the piano. The piano floated and was destroyed. The guitar was saved because it floated on top of the piano. So the guitar made it, but the piano did not. The devastation, you've just seen a mild example here, but one of the worst examples is this one. And there are more pictures, but I even hesitated to bring this. But Anthony, you take this one down. One of the places where the levee did actually break was right next to the 40 Fort Cemetery. And graves were disinterred, bodies, caskets over the streets, human remains. There's still a marker at that cemetery where those that were gathered up could be collectively buried because the majority of them could not be identified to go back in a specific grave. It was a horrid, horrid sight. I must say I did not see it in person because all of my time was spent
Yeah, I did.
up to a point with civil defense and getting the broadcasts out. General Toundon was very worried about how people, once they got back in, would take the devastation that they saw emotionally. And so well before people were allowed back in, news reporters were sent out, including myself, in Army trucks, the big, what they call deuce-and-a-half trucks, that could go through almost anything. And we were then told, especially in radio and in newspaper, to please put together a word picture of what people could expect to see. to give them some little forewarning of the disaster they were about to see. Now, obviously, you couldn't lighten the load for somebody who was coming to their house the first time, but they knew they were going to see wreckage, and they knew they were going to see thick mud caked everywhere, and they knew there was going to be quite an odor in the air from all of that mud that was all over the place. Thank you, Anthony. And I'm going to show you one more photo in just a moment. There were several people that really led us in terms of let's get together, let's fight this thing to make a good comeback. One of them was Congressman Dan Flood. Now Dan, you may remember him, he was always pictured the big handlebar mustache. He'd been a Shakespearean actor, quite a fella, usually couldn't remember anybody's name, called everybody Jake. But his assistant, Mike Clark, knew everybody, and he would say, "That's Dave from WILK," and you know. But Dan was the head of the Military Appropriations Committee. Now, one of the things we needed immediately were helicopters. Well, let me tell you, when Dan Flood asked for helicopters, we probably became the helicopter capital of the entire nation because we got all the helicopters we needed. The other guy that was so key in the comeback was the fellow who was at the center of this picture, Anthony. This gentleman just passed away a couple of years ago. And check to the ladies. Was named Frank Carlucci. Now, Frank Carlucci was a veteran of government. He at one time was assistant head of management and budget, I think, or assistant head of CIA. On that photo, I think Anthony's pointing it out, you'll see a gentleman reaching in with microphones. Looks like Elvis Presley sideburns. That was the 1972 David Decosmo. I looked a little bit different then. Fortunately, there are pictures to preserve. I'm not sure if that's a boon or not. But Frank Carlucci grew up in Wyoming Valley, and President Nixon appointed Frank Carlucci as his personal representative. And very frankly, if somebody came to Frank Carlucci and said, "We need A or we need B," Frank got right through to the President of the United States and said, "They need A and they need B," and basically we got them. Now, it wasn't all as timely as we would have liked. George Romney was the head of Housing and Urban Development at the time. And George was responsible for getting mobile homes into our area to provide temporary housing. And he made a personal appearance and basically was sort of boasting to everybody how quickly things were being done. And all of the newsmen were there to hear this man, a very prominent political leader, talk about what a good job they were doing. And in the audience was a lady named Min Matheson. Min was one of the head people in the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. She was a feisty union lady who took backseat to no one, interrupted the news conference and basically said, "Mr. Romney, you're not doing half of what we need, half as fast as we need it." And all the cameras turned toward Min. Thank you, Anthony. And things started to progress even faster at that time. With so many people working together, yes, radio was the hero of the hour in terms of getting out emergency information. But the National Guard, policemen, nurses, people that actually turned College Misericordia into a hospital. We lost Nesbitt Hospital and Wilkes-Barre Hospital, one on each side of the Susquehanna River. And College Misericordia became a hospital. There were several babies born there during the flood emergency. The Wyoming Valley Mall was fairly new at that time and actually made a great start. You wouldn't know it now, but it was essential in a place to get things and to go and get some of the things you needed. We had a gentleman come in from the state of Pennsylvania. I believe his name was Wilcox. And he had something to do with housing at the state level to help us out. And I remember him saying he was going to be based at the Naval Reserve Center at the Wilkes-Barre-Scranton Airport. And he was going up there the next day, riding his bike from civil defense all the way up there. And Mr. Wilcox was a rather robust person, fairly heavy. And some of us thought, that's a neat thing. Let's do it too. I made it halfway till I needed to get in a car and go the rest of the way. He didn't tell us he rode a bike every day. So he was well prepared to make that trip. Many of us were not. But we had people like that were coming in and helping out. The help from the Amish people, tremendous. Come in and help rebuild. Neighbor helping neighbor, unbelievable. Person to shovel out this deep mud from his basement, from his first floor, and then go to his neighbor's house who may be older and help him or her out. Just an amazing thing. The storm leaves me with concerns, some very serious concerns. Now, we had statewide 122 people died as a direct result of the Agnes flood in 1972. In Wyoming Valley, the hardest hit area in the entire East Coast, we had 3 deaths. 2 of them were rescue workers. One was one fellow who didn't make it away from sandbagging quite fast enough. There may possibly have been another, maybe even a 5th, but I have no documentation on that. The 3 I know are documented, and their names are in one of the books, by the way. I tell people, if you're in any kind of an emergency and you're given an evacuation order, please leave. There's a strong feeling among people that they can stay, they can do for themselves, and they can save themselves and save their property. And they may very well be able to do that. But if they're caught, a rescue worker has to put his or her life on the line to go out and save the person that decided to stay. Again, 2 of the people we lost were rescue workers. One had a heart attack, involved in rescue operations. Second thing I tell people is have these items in a place where you know they're available to you and you get them. And something like your driver's license. And most men carry them in their wallets, and they're safe there. You can replace a house. Try to replace a wedding album. Try to replace your family photo album. Next to impossible. The thing I heard most months after the flood, I wished I had saved those pictures of my grandma, of my mom, of my dad. They're gone forever. House is being cleaned up, house is being rebuilt, photos are gone. That seems like such an insignificant thing, but to a person at a personal level, that's a very, very vital thing. The damage total from Tropical Storm Agnes, from Florida up through the Northeast, was at that time just over $2 billion. $1 billion was Luzerne County. Half of the total damage was Luzerne County. At today's rate, that is $14 billion in today's dollars. Just to give you an idea of that. I will tell you something else that most people do not remember at all, and I understand why they don't remember. But several days after the flood, there were more lives lost. And they were newsmen. There were news people from WCAU in Philadelphia who did a helicopter fly over the area. There was a news paperman with them as well. And their helicopter crashed at Capital City's airport. So some news people actually gave their lives in that disaster. Now, the other thing that I'm really concerned about, when the disaster happened and that radio network formed, we had 13 area radio stations giving you information. We had volunteers from those stations coming to take shifts on that network. One of them one evening was Mike Stevens. You all know Mike Stevens. Mike came up to an armed National Guardsman and said, "You can't go past here." And Mike said, "I have to go do a report on the flood emergency network. I can't let anybody pass. My orders are not to let anybody pass." And Mike walked past him and said, "Shoot me if you have to. I'm going in to do my job." And he came in and took his shift on the network. Pretty chancy when you stop to think about it under the circumstances. But let's get back to today versus then. You have a similar emergency now. Most of those 13 radio stations do not exist today. They're gone completely. There are 2 radio stations in the Wilkes-Barre-Scranton area that do any news. WILK and WSCR, I guess, in the Scranton area. WILK's news is generally 2 stories, and it stops at 6 o'clock at night. Now, we had a tornado went through a shopping center just about 3-4 years ago down in our area. Happened at night. I foolishly started to turn my radio because I'd heard a rumor about a tornado. I'm turning the dial, I'm saying, "Wait a minute, what am I doing? There's nobody on there that knows anything about this." Now, as it happens, Nancy Kamen from WILK was smart enough to come in and broadcast some information on it. On the other hand, if you listen to WILK regularly, you had no expectation that anybody was going to be there that night doing news because normally there was not anyone there. So how now will I get information about Joe being at point A and his wife being at point B? Well, the logical answer would be that Joe will call his wife, except believe it or not, these go down. The cell towers go down. We have the ability on these to broadcast an Amber Alert to tell you that a girl is missing, that she may be in a car driven by her father who's estranged from the mother or something. But we don't have the ability to localize, regionalize, and then localize this to the point where we can say, Joe's over here, he's safe. So one of the things I will be talking about with the Federal Emergency Management workers when I'm on their Zoom call is start thinking about ways that you can, this still may be your best device, but you've got to find a way to utilize it the way we utilize those radio stations to get very specific and very personal information out to everybody as quickly as you can. Television can do the job in terms of getting the information out, but if you're evacuating, there's chances are you don't have a television set in your car and can't watch it as you're going. Newspapers, obviously, they publish the information the next day. That's not going to do you any good when they say that shelter A is closed because there's a problem, so go to shelter B. Now, some of that you can do by virtue of emergency signals, but a lot of the very specific and very personal information you can't do. And that is something that has me concerned, and I think that has got to be discussed in the future. Agnes was no lady. Agnes was a problem. And the question I always get is, can it happen again? And the answer that I give is yes, absolutely. And to an extent, I can almost say, expect it. Don't say, can it happen again? Expect it will happen again. Not a photocopy of what happened. The levees in Wilkes-Barre have been raised. And once, in 2011, the river darn near topped those levees. But since it didn't top those levees, it flooded elsewhere. And sections of West Pittston that were not hit during Agnes were hit in the 2011 flood, and communities up and down the line. Whenever you remediate a flood emergency, you are remediating it in a specific area. And above and below that area, you've now put other people in a precarious situation. I don't know if any of you have been to Sunbury, Pennsylvania at all, a very lovely community that has big walls between the community and the river. I mean, Wilkes-Barre has them now too, but they look like King Kong walls in Sunbury. Wilkes-Barre flooded in '72. The water was exactly at the top of those walls in Sunbury. If Wilkes-Barre hadn't flooded, Sunbury would have. There's a cause and effect. So anytime you do make a change, you can expect other areas, especially if you're talking about flood, talking about low-lying areas that are going to pay a cost. But once again, Mother Nature doesn't only send floods. Mother Nature sends, how many times have you seen in the past 5 years strong winds, damaging winds, that, is it my memory that when I was in my 20s, 30s, and 40s, and even 50s, I can't remember seeing storms like that hitting our area? Or if they did, and I'm not remembering, it wasn't 2, 3, 4, or 5 storms a year. It might have been perhaps one. And so I suggest, yes, climate change is real. Now you can argue back and forth as to what causes it, whether man is a big contributing force, whether he's not, but it is changing. And that change is something we're going to have to deal with. We may have to have, in an area like Missouri and Lackawanna County, we may get to the point where we need tornado sirens, such as they have out west. We aren't at it yet, but it could happen as things continue to evolve. And once again, the big emergency notice, you can pretty well get out there. But the specific personal information, you can't. When I went to that civil defense headquarters in the sub-basement, thinking that we may or may not have a flood, I called my wife and I said, I'll be home a little late. I stopped in 3 days later for a couple hours and then went back to the place where I was sleeping in the Wilkes-Barre School District Administration building on the floor. And a lot of other people put in a lot more time than I did. Emergencies happen, they're going to continue to happen. You got to be ready the best you can, and you cannot be in a panic mode, which is why we didn't want to evacuate at night. We had time to evacuate during the day, but first we had time, that one last ditch effort to try to head off the flooding. Didn't happen. We've had the emergencies up here in Lackawanna County. The Lackawanna River was certainly affected. And when the rivers are beginning to be affected, the small streams and creeks are affected. And people living along those have to deal with some of these disastrous situations. I can't say enough for the people that helped out. Again, agencies like the Red Cross and helped out. The next year, in 1973, we had a very bad rainstorm, and you could feel the panic in Luzerne County. You could feel the trepidation because everything was fresh in everybody's mind. Now see, it's not fresh now. It's going to be refreshed because of the 50th anniversary. And it'll be refreshed in the minds of those that lived through it. Won't be refreshed in these folks' minds. Anthony knows about the Titanic, but he doesn't know about the 1972 flood. But he could face something like that when he's older. And the people that are going to get, or should be able to get the information to him, have got to be ready to do it in the most effective and the most personal manner. I could try to paint a word picture to you of many other areas down there, but I wasn't in most of them. I'd strictly be repeating what you're going to see on some of these special broadcasts. But now you'll know when you see some of them, some of the background that went into what you're seeing. You'll see some of the workers from National Guard. You'll probably see some of the Amish people rebuilding. Probably see General Towner making an announcement. Probably see a couple of footage a little bit of footage of film with a young fellow with big sideburns talking to everybody. Wave to me. I thank you for your attention. If there are any questions, I will try to answer them.
Were there any ham operators involved?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. The question was there any ham operators involved? Because we didn't have telephone communication, State Police Radio, Army National Guard radio, amateur radio operators, even citizen band radio operators were key in getting information back and forth. So our radio network might have been able to tell Joe's wife where he was, but we found Joe because the folks in the ham radio operator found him and they called in the information to us. So yes, amateur radio and two-way radio systems were essential in getting information back and forth. Well, once again, I thank you for your attention. I thank you for inviting me back here to Archibald, and I hope that I'll be able to join you once again, although my knowledge on various big events is somewhat limited to those I was involved in one way or another, and I guess the last really big one was the Kennedy-Kopechne case, when Mary Jo Kopechne died in the car driven by Senator Edward Kennedy, and believe it or not, I'm tied in with that story too. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve.